Welcome, everybody, to our latest installment of Executive Webinar Series. My name is Jahn Karsybaev. I'm CIO of myBasePay and the host of today's webinar. And today we're covering a very interesting and important topic, especially very pertinent to current days, on direct sourcing and executive strategies for implementation such talent acquisition initiatives. We have an amazing panel of industry thought leaders prepared for you guys today, and I'll let each one of them introduce themselves. We have a range of prepared topics for the bulk of the most of the duration of the webinar, and I'll allocate about 10-15 minutes towards the end of the events for a live Q&A. But for our participants, feel free to send your questions along the way, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the end. And so that's all of the logistics, and we're ready to get started. So with that said, I'll start with the brief introductions of our panelists. Maybe, Brian, I'll start with you with a quick self-introduction of yourself, thumbnail version of your career, and brief overview of what you're doing these days.
Okay, thanks, John. I appreciate it. My name is Brian McGuire. I'm the head of sales at TALENTBELT. We are an advisory service that specializes in direct sourcing. We help customers put together a business case, build a solution model, and select suppliers. I've been in the industry primarily MSP and VMS sales, RPO sales, solution design since about 1995. I've been with TALENTBELT since 2020, and thank you for this invitation. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. And Dustin?
Thanks for having us, John. Dustin Talley with Simplified. We started last year. Prior to that, I was in the MSP space as well, and then spent a decade in the IC compliance AOR, EOR business, where we built a direct sourcing solution. Talent Simplified is all about helping companies, whether that's the solution providers themselves or the companies that are exploring direct to talent, do just that, go more directly to the talent.
And tell us where you're located today.
Today I'm in the lovely city of Manchester, where the sun did come out at one point. So we're on holiday with the family for a few weeks.
Oh, that's super exciting. And thank you guys for those introductions. Very excited about the conversation today. Dustin, I'm going to start out with you with the, we don't want to assume anything with the expertise of our participants and those who joined us today. Tell us a little bit more about what direct sourcing is in general. Maybe provide some examples of, what it's all about, and maybe a brief history of how just the overall concept and the strategy of direct sourcing was born.
Sure, and I'll tell you, I'm going to be long-winded on this one. So we give the short answers to this one sometimes, and we keep hearing from companies that they still don't get it. What is direct sourcing? Why should I even be exploring it? So for me, direct sourcing is about companies accessing talent directly, right? That's the simple definition of it. To me, it also largely follows the direct to consumer movement. So largely why I call it direct to talent, and direct sourcing kind of falls in that narrative as well. It is companies are trying to elevate the experience and be more in control of that experience in going directly to talent. And some things they do to do that is leverage their brand to attract the talent. They're more in the driver's seat when it comes to actually controlling the experience. And thereby they get results in terms of access to the actual reporting, the data that largely today might sit with like staffing suppliers, right? You don't know how many candidates applied to a job, what the experience of those candidates were like. And so if you compare that to direct to consumer, where brands are now going direct to these individuals, building pools of individuals or databases of individuals that they sell to. Similarly, we're doing that with direct sourcing, where you're going direct to individuals. You're building up a talent pool of individuals that are your first stop to see, do we have this already in our inventory? And then for times when you don't, you're leveraging a primary supplier, partner, or internally going out and sourcing those talent. Again, with the control of the brand and the company, what they want to put in the in the driver's seat, they are in that driver's seat controlling that experience.
Well, that makes perfect sense, Dustin, and I appreciate those examples that definitely clarify a lot of the complexities of the direct sourcing that we're going to dive deeper into further through this conversation. Brian, you've been in this space for quite some time. You've seen the industry shift in all different directions and cycles. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what industry trends have contributed to an accelerated growth of strategies such as direct sourcing, especially in the past couple of years.
That is a big question, and I'll try to answer that in a reasonable amount of time. I would say COVID-19 is probably the obvious answer these days, but I think COVID-19 may be just a road marker here. I think that there are a lot of other factors at play. I think the way people look for work has been changing for a while now, particularly among younger workers. We've seen a shift towards social media, gig platforms, word of mouth, a lot of what we would call non-traditional staffing models emerge in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think that's a factor, probably a cultural factor. I think the way that employers hire is also changing. I think there's now less emphasis on education and work pedigree, maybe more of an emphasis now on capabilities, objectifying people's skills and ability. There's obviously a pronounced push right now for diversity and inclusion in the workforce. So that's a huge change in, say, the last 10 years. I think artificial intelligence is a big factor here. It's definitely matured a lot in, say, the last 5 years and continues to accelerate. So I think it's certainly up to the task now of matching workers to jobs. Remote work has exploded under COVID. I looked up some numbers on this. I think at the peak in the pandemic, about 61% of the workforce was off-site. That has now sort of dialed back a bit, but we've leveled off at about 35% of the workforce working remotely these days. This is obviously driven by things like reliable low-cost video conferencing like we're using right now. So big paradigm shift there. I do think the elephant in the room, though, is the Great Resignation, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit more later today. But according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 47 million people voluntarily quit their jobs in 2021 alone. That's a huge number, unprecedented, and it's not all due to COVID. If you look at, for example, the Gallup poll, people do a study called the State of the American Workplace Report. They've been doing it since 2013. It's been pretty much the same every year since 2013. The findings are, pretty disheartening. They say about 30% of workers are engaged, 50% are disengaged, meaning they're just kind of on autopilot at work. And the scary number is 20% of workers are so angry at their employer that they're actively trying to subvert the company. And even in the Gallup report, they said, imagine 20% of your workforce is drilling a hole in the boat that you're on right now. So this has been a long time in the making. And, you can look at it economically too. Since the 80s, companies have been chasing short-term profits at the expense of long-term growth. Reinvestment is pretty much non-existent. Employee retention, people talk about it, but it doesn't necessarily happen. In the last 20 years, you saw $57 trillion in recorded merger and acquisition activity. If you think about that, that's double our national debt right now in the last 20 years. Entry-level jobs are being eliminated and automated. Mid-level jobs are being filled by low-cost temp workers. Senior level jobs have been outsourced to permanent consulting culture. So there's been a lot going on. And I think in a nutshell, direct sourcing could potentially restore a sense of power and control to workers. So I think this is an exciting time.
Well, those are definitely impressive numbers, and I appreciate you sharing some of those stats on those industry analysis. It's astounding, especially in the past couple of years. And
Hey,
to
John,
look at
I've heard a talk track. I'll add something to Brian's commentary there too. I've heard a talk track where the idea of employment is, we all know it in our lifetime, is really only like 150 years old. If you think about it, the Industrial Revolution is what fast forwarded and everybody started working for these big organizations. And that's really unwinding itself. And that's kind of some of what we're experiencing here and the rationale behind so many people going contract, freelance, gig.
Right. No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And Dustin, to stay on that topic a little bit further, to look at it from a different perspective of the recruitment industry and from a staffing organization perspective, as an example, what do you think is the impact of direct sourcing and strategies as such on staffing companies, recruitment firms who specialize in providing such service to talent acquisition teams and maybe corporate teams at the enterprise level? And how can such organizations prepare for corporate talent acquisition teams adopting more and more actively strategies such as direct sourcing?
Sure. Yeah, and a really good question. So I'll go back like 5 or 6 years ago. There's a conference that all of us probably attend, and it was the first year they did the gig version of that conference. And I still remember staffing suppliers standing up and like arguing that this is not coming, this is not the future. Speaking specifically to direct sourcing and even some of the talent marketplaces that are out there, I think it's safe to say it has caught up to us at this point. That said, I don't know, Brian and I are in a Slack channel, industry Slack channel. And so we kind of put out a similar question a couple of weeks ago, and we asked, how disruptive has this been so far? Specifically just the direct sourcing piece of it, right? So we'll leave freelance management, other marketplaces, gig solutions out of this for now. Conservatively, only 5% of companies have actually had a mature direct sourcing program in place. That means 95% of companies do not. And then of those 5%, and then the percentage that are maybe exploring or just launching programs, if you combine all of that, the solution providers today believe that only 1% of the total addressable market has been moved to direct sourcing. So there's still a lot of buzz though, right? We're all talking about it. The stat last year was that 60% of buyers are exploring this. I think Brian and I can tell you firsthand, there are a number of companies that have been kicking this around the last 6 months, kind of trying to figure out what they're going to do with this. It's in like acceleration mode right now. So the providers that we all work with are insanely busy with RFPs, the sales pitches, the solutions being presented. So fast forward that 1% over the next couple of years, and you're going to see it be fairly disruptive to the total addressable market within staffing. So what do staffing companies do about that, or what does that mean to them? For some, they will either ignore it and start to see some of their market share actually disrupted, right? It'll go to these various solutions. And there's good reasons for that. Staffing companies often work with different margins than direct sourcing does. Direct sourcing is really a volume game, and it's kind of rewinding back the clock about 15, 20 years ago to when we had master vendor or vendor on premise, but with some updates to it. And so for staffing companies, we've Brian and I have probably both talked to quite a few that they kind of say, I either have to set up a whole nother division, and yes, then maybe we'll go do this. And so that might be a viable solution. If you're looking at your P&L and your leadership doesn't want your numbers impacted, maybe it's an entirely separate division, and you could work with direct sourcing. You could kind of double down on some niche areas. And largely what I mean by that is find those like hard to fill roles, and largely the programs that don't have a specific amount of market share in any one area of expertise, and stay focused on that. You'll keep your higher margins with those, obviously. But what you'll start to see happen is the volume plays that exist in these contingent labor programs will predominantly be filled by the direct sourcing suppliers. And then as a tier 2 result, they'll then go to suppliers that can maybe help fill those hard to fill roles if the direct sourcing supplier can't do it either quickly enough or can't perform on that role. So those are some tips I have for suppliers, and just kind of thinking, fast forwarding where this thing plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And Dustin, you've touched a little bit on the implementation strategies for the corporate talent acquisition teams when it comes to, consider all of the advantages and disadvantages of direct sourcing as a strategy. Brian, curious to get your thoughts on what are the considerations in place for corporate TA teams, as an example, to take into account before considering direct sourcing as a hiring strategy as one of the talent acquisition strategies?
Great question. Again, I think probably the first consideration is, hey, do we have a business case? Is it compelling? Why are we looking at direct sourcing? Basically, what are we trying to solve for here? So I think first, having that understanding of what direct sourcing is, what the implications are, kind of dovetailing on something Dustin just said, staffing is fundamentally built around a geographic model with brick and mortar offices. It's typically human resource intensive, which makes it expensive versus using direct sourcing, which is largely remote, AI driven. So just understanding what's possible, setting some realistic goals, knowing where to go get data on your current program to build a business case is huge. At some point, you're going to have to probably go to somebody and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing direct sourcing. This is why I want to do it. This is what I expect the ROI to be. We have a problem. The problem's costing us X. Here's the data to support that. Here's how we're going to measure ROI. So being able to sort of start by having that high level discussion with leadership, with stakeholders, getting a green light to move forward. And then I think, just making sure in your strategy, being realistic about your internal bandwidth, your internal skills, learning a little bit about the market, who's out there, who's in your vertical, who's in your geography, and sort of boiling that all down before just building it into your strategy. I think, you need to have an understanding of what it is and a reason to do it. And just something that I share with, customers myself is the business case for direct sourcing is typically around fulfillment. I think a lot of people make a mistake and come in and say, I'm looking to lower my cost of delivery. I can do this cheaper than my MSP or my staffing suppliers. I think the question we typically ask is, if you were to run a report today, how many average open recs do you have every month? And how many new ones are being created? And if you have, say, 20% of these openings, what is that costing you in terms if you're a manufacturing company, or if these are distribution and logistics recs, what does that contribute to your bottom line? That's your real business case. It's not saving maybe a couple $100,000 on delivery or staffing markups. The real implication are what are those unfilled recs costing you? And I've had some people say, well, that's really not a fair way to build a business case. And I say, okay, then close the recs. If you don't need them and they don't matter to the company, close them then. They're not real. And people kind of sit back and smile at that point and have that sort of realization. I think it was Peter Drucker that used to do that. He's like the sort of original management consultant. They're one of them. He would say, if you want to find out what the cost or value is of something in the company, imagine that it's not there tomorrow. Take it out of the equation. So, again, maybe I'm beating a dead horse, but I'm a big fan of having a solid business case. I think that's where it sort of starts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brian. Dustin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to kind of keep commenting on it too. You have buyers that come in that are strictly exploring this for purposes of cost savings. And I think the industry kind of gets tired of that at some point, right? It's just like a race to the bottom. This is a volume play. I think it produces cost savings. That's inevitable. But there's a much greater case to be made about, as I compared it earlier, to the direct-to-consumer experience, where you can actually get in control of your brand and the quality and the experience, and all of those things should be put at the forefront. But agreed, buyers aren't always asking, why am I doing this? They're not asking themselves that and producing the true business case, to Brian's point. And I think more of that needs to be done versus just being sold or being peer pressured into direct sourcing. Don't do this if it's peer pressure. Figure out your why and then move forward.
Right. Just a couple things maybe practically to add to this. I think some of the things you need to consider internally too, and Dustin mentioned earlier, do you have access to your brand? Will your marketing organization or whoever controls your brand allow you to use it to attract contingent labor? Big factor right there. Can you access your applicant tracking system? So the average organization has 200,000 resumes sitting in an ATS, and you could ask those folks to join a talent community if they're interested in contingent work. So do you have access to that? That's going to contribute to success. again, I would ask, are you filling roles, multiple roles of the same skill set? You know, to Dustin's point, it doesn't make sense to source and curate a talent community for a role you're going to hire once or twice a year. So tends to work in a repetitive type of an environment. And then, do you have an MSP? Do you have a VMS? Direct sourcing programs typically rely on a VMS for receiving requisitions, submitting candidates, managing bill pay, managing offers, all of that kind of stuff. And then, again, what's your relationship with your staffing suppliers? I think that's a factor too that needs to be considered, because there are going to be implications there. So yeah, there's a practical side to this too, beyond the business case.
Well, I love these questions, and it comes up almost to a checklist type of scenario where you have to consider a lot of these complexities, because it's not a simple strategy that you can implement overnight. Which leads me to a further question. Maybe Dustin, you can help shed some light a little bit further on that. What are some of the initial steps that Corp TA teams to get started on the implementation of the direct sourcing? Where to start? What are some of the initial things to consider? Do they go the big bang throughout the entire organization, or baby steps? Tell us a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, sure thing. So the most likely starting point is talk to those that have done it before. I would say we're about 6 to 8 years into true direct sourcing taking place. I missed an opportunity earlier to say something. I'll say it now just in case he's listening. We put it to a group of our peers again and said, who actually came up with this direct sourcing thing? Because everyone kind of claims like we've been doing it 10 years, 20, whatever it is, right? But most folks agree that Rick Roberts actually invented the term direct sourcing. Now, we've probably been doing some version of it for 10, 20 years for sure. RPO kind of had a head start on that. And so you could go look at and talk to RPO programs. You could talk to, I love that people are commenting now. Thanks, Wynn. Now, you could go look at RPO programs. You could go talk to other programs that have actually implemented that. I missed a plug opportunity earlier for myself. I launched a community called Direct Collective, and it actually reverses the cycle. So this is largely predicated on, I used to sell a solution, and I would try to create the problem that I wanted to solve with everything I sold, right? And so you have buyers, clients that are buying things that they don't know if it's the right solution. And so I think go talk, instead of waiting till the end of that sales cycle and like, let me get your references and go talk to the top 3 that are going to say, yeah, they're amazing. Go talk to people that have actually failed. Go talk to people that have succeeded as well. So I'll tell you, chatting with Terry Gallagher this morning, and I've actually failed about a dozen times at direct sourcing. And we were commenting and joking about how there's a lot of imposters in the space. There's a lot of people now that it is a hot topic. They'll say direct, I can do direct sourcing. Sure. That means I get your volume. I'm going to say yes to that. But you'll find not all of them can succeed at that. So asking things like, do you have an implementation plan? Let me see it. What does that look like? This isn't like activating just a typical staffing supplier. You don't turn it on and start sending recs. There's a lot of strategy involved in this. And if you get it wrong, your brand is what actually gets a poor reputation. So it's worth getting it right. It is worth exploring it. So I'm glad that people are in this exploratory phase right now. I'm excited to see it take off beyond this, obviously. But those are some things I would mention. Skip ahead a little bit. The other thing I would say is pilot this. If you're worried about the big bang approach and being too disruptive to your program, a pilot is a great place to start. It might actually help you create your business case. Every provider in the room just like, rub their eyeballs or, turn me off or something. We hate pilots because it means you're not getting the revenue initially and you have to still put the same effort in the beginning. But pilots are a strong way to prove that to your organization and get the ball moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dustin. I want to double click on that a little bit further as part of that implementation strategy. Brian, maybe you can help us shed some light on that particular space. Is it recommended to leverage curation partner or internally managed program? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages maybe on either side of the spectrum?
Well, maybe sort of building on what Dustin was just saying, I think really the key is, if you haven't rolled out a program, you probably want to leverage somebody who has. Now, whether that's a third-party curation firm, whether it's your MSP who's done it, whether it's an internal vendor management office, or even third parties, there are organizations like TALENTBELT, my organization, gets involved in this, and solution design, supplier selection, MSA negotiation. We don't necessarily do the implementation, but we can take you a long way there. Rolling out a program, so there's a tendency, I think, to compare this to MSP, VMS, and I don't think that level of complexity is here. I don't want to oversimplify it and say, sure, it's just like adding a supplier, no problem. But I think if I had to put it on the spectrum, it's closer to adding a supplier than it is to rolling out an MSP. So, it can take, generally, I don't know, I hope people will keep me honest, maybe 8 to 10 weeks to roll out. I think there are variables there, like the complexity of integrations and workflow and things like that. But this is not a huge change management type event. I think one of the key considerations too is, we touched on integrations a second ago. This is going to rely on your VMS technology. If you don't have a VMS, then we're going to have to piece together, okay, how are we going to receive requisitions? How are we going to track time? How are we going to pay workers? Typically, you're going to use your payroll provider as an employer of record for the direct source talent. So they're going to get onboarded and managed through your payroll provider, or you may have to go out and find a payroll provider. So that may add a level of complexity to it as well. But ultimately, a curation partner, an MSP, the talent technology providers themselves can definitely get involved with creating scope. And by scope, I mean, what geographies are we going to start with? What business units? What job types? Requirements involves typically mapping your current process, identifying gaps in the process, asking which functions in this process should we automate. Now, you can automate everything, but it doesn't make sense necessarily to automate everything. So you look at that. You look at the size of your curation team, whether you have the ability to do it in-house, if your MSP is going to do it. Are they going to earmark resources? How is it going to impact their percentage of spend? Solution design, project management, Dustin touched on already. I think most organizations use Project Management Institute methodology. Everybody's seen it. It's initiate, plan, execute, monitor, close. So that is going to sort of factor in here. And you do want to be asking whoever you're working with, do you guys have a formal methodology for this? Do you have a RACI that we can assign roles? Do you have a timeline that we're going to sort of build backwards from a go live date? Is there a communications plan? Is there a training plan? And then beyond that, somebody to work with updating your job template library, job descriptions, your employer brand. And then there's an aspect of sort of search engine optimization here. When you're involved in sourcing, you want to be asking like, hey, are people opening this? Are they sticky? Are they staying on the page? Are they leaving quickly? What are we doing wrong? You can assign people to go out and look at your competition and ask, hey, what are they doing? Let's look at where they're advertising. What do their job descriptions say? If they're beating us in the market, let's figure out why and copy them and try to leapfrog them. So, there's definitely a lot to this, but I certainly wouldn't want to scare people away by saying, oh yeah, it's like rolling out an MSP. 18 months from now, you're going to have a lot of gray hair. You maybe even have left the company by then. This really doesn't need to be that complex. And I think, there are certainly lessons to be learned from that industry. So thanks for indulging me on the long-winded answer. Appreciate it.
I'll add to your long-windedness. I've implemented a few internally managed programs. Most of them do not ramp like those managed by curators, simply because they don't have the workforce to support it. There are a few exceptions to that, some professional services companies that have large scale teams already and invest heavily. They actually start those years at a loss though, if you think about the amount of salaries it takes to have that team and start ramping. So if results is on your plate for year one, and you don't have the budget, the only option you have is a curator. There are some cool programs that are doing some really neat things with internal resources. And I've actually seen some of those internally managed programs now starting to reach out to curators as consultants to start asking questions. So it's cool to kind of watch the whole thing, the whole ecosystem evolve and start to play together.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And Brian, you've mentioned a few project management strategies as part of the overall implementation and the management of the rollout of the program, and definitely speaks my language. And as part of that methodology, when we talk about org readiness stage of this and the communication with internal and the external suppliers, maybe Dustin, you can shed some light first on that. In terms of preparation process, ensuring that the existing suppliers are well prepared and equipped prior to the launch of this direct sourcing program, what are some of the considerations there through that initial cycle?
Yeah, keep them informed. Let them know what's going on. This should not take them by surprise, right? That if that is the case, you're probably not being a good partner to your suppliers. And this is a partnership. I definitely see the programs where suppliers are suppliers, not partners. And you can tell that. To that point, this is not just another supplier. This is a partner. You will get very familiar with these folks. They essentially become an extension of your team, or they are your team if it's an internally managed program. But bring your suppliers on the journey. So if you have a supplier that's performing well in a particular area, and that's a large area that you might export and move into direct sourcing, include them in the RFP, even if they don't offer direct sourcing yet, right? Give them a chance to take on the volume. They're already performing well for you. So I'd just say, look at your scorecards, figure out who to invite to those. For those that are not being invited, right? They're just the normal suppliers are gonna keep performing well in the roles that they do. Let them know what that means, right? Are they gonna see a significantly less volume in this program over the next year? The roles that they are getting, are those going to be roles that they already attempted to source through the direct sourcing channel, and now it's coming to them as like a tier 2 supplier? I think they have a right to know those things. And the roles that they're getting that maybe is a niche role, you might need to communicate that still, right? Because I've seen programs, actually the very first program I was able to launch, for some reason it still is around today. You would think you'd fail on your first one, not your latter ones. But they were very aggressive about not only moving the direct, all the supply over to the direct sourcing channel. In addition to that, they would take the 6-month rule hard and fast. So once you've met 6 months, they'd actually take that resource and transition them to the payroll provider. So staffing companies largely, their margins were tough to make up on this program. They weren't getting the volume anymore. And therefore, this became like a B or C client for them. So the quality of their suppliers went down quite considerably, meaning they did have to rely on direct sourcing. So if you're the direct sourcing partner in that program, good for you, you succeeded. But it was at the expense of eliminating a lot of other partners. So you've got to think about these things as levers, and you've got to pull them at the right time. And I think a lot of people will tell you this is like a 3-year journey. You can activate this, and year one's kind of like a building year, and you could certainly do everything in year one if you wanted. But look at it like a 3-year journey. And what does that look like for you as an organization? And how can you keep your supply base, your current supply base even, partnered up with you as a company?
Brian, anything you can add to that as part of the preparation of the existing supply network?
Yeah, no, I think great comments, Dustin. I agree 100% with what you just said. I think I might add, just looking at the greater or larger context. I mentioned context earlier. That's kind of a favorite word of mine. But did we just host a staffing RFP where we went and negotiated with our suppliers and sort of chiseled everybody down on their markups and rates? So timing is certainly important. I would look at standard MSAs with suppliers. If you didn't just have an RFP, understand what you promise to suppliers. A lot of times there's a, sort of a guarantee of a certain spend volume or REX in exchange for volume pricing or something like that. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration. I think I would have a discussion with your MSP or your PMO or whoever manages your supplier base, and just get a general feel for the state of mind of suppliers at a given time. If hiring volume has fallen off, perceptibly for the company, and everybody's sort of suffering and disengaged, I think you want to be careful about the timing of your message. And then I think when it's time for that message, I would probably work with the MSP and or VMO to craft a memo to the suppliers. I think I would be really specific about what I'm considering. I would carve out specific roles, again, repetitively hired roles that are really sort of very bespoke to direct sourcing. I would let the suppliers know what I'm thinking about doing, what the timing is, what the anticipated impact is. And I would probably follow that memo up with a Zoom call where everybody's involved, MSP, VMO, curation provider, reps from the suppliers, and sort of have a discussion, let everybody be heard, understand what the pain points are, and just figure out a way forward that sort of cares for all of the parties involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout your guys, as you guys were explaining some of these strategies, technology has come up several times as part of the, the supplementary solution that would really help streamline probably the complex process of the implementation, such as, of direct sourcing. Dustin, can you tell us a little bit more, maybe share some recommendations when it comes to technology solutions that can help optimize the adoption of direct sourcing and its scalability?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's caught up, right? So technology is now in the mix. They're purpose-built direct sourcing technologies, right? Technologies that help you talent pool, reach talent directly. They plug into vendor management systems. So there's really no excuse not to be exploring direct sourcing at this point. Years ago, that used to be the excuse. It was, oh, it's in an Excel file somewhere, and I've got to go look at that Excel file and see if there's somebody to redeploy or someone that was interested in full-time role. And so now you've got all the tools to tie it together. And so adoption is inevitable. And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing the adoption. The supply side or the service side of this has been ready for a long time. But the technology is what has gotten us there. So I'm not going to mention any specific technologies. All of my friends are on the phone. So you guys can go research them. And Brian and my firm, we are happy to point folks to solutions as well and help you figure out what might be best for you. But there are a lot of different tools out there to explore. The key of it is you've got really two components, though. You've got the sourcing aspect of it, which arguably you could do that with any supplier. That looks a lot like what it used to look like years ago with the master vendor on-premise model. Which I'll add, if you look at this, the margins are kind of just going back to what they used to be back then. I remember being on site at Merrill Lynch in the early 2000s, and we were the primary staffing supplier, and it was a 28% margin back then. And then they introduced MSP, VMS to supposedly save money. But what happened in some of those programs that actually had decent rates was now you were just spreading the market share and the rates actually went up. And so now we're getting back to a place where it's like, well, if I actually sent all of my volume to one supplier, would those rates normalize a bit more? And so you're starting to see that take place. I'm going on a whole rabbit trail here, obviously, but I do think that's one of the things that's taking place is we're just kind of reverting back to the way things were 20 years ago. The technology is helping us to do that. And then quality is kind of at the forefront of this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you, because at the end of the day, it's the candidate who really benefits from all of that. So that's super exciting. Brian, can you share some examples perhaps of how can direct sourcing program work within a traditional contingent labor program that may already be in place at an organization?
Well, yeah, I think, to some extent we touched on, how to approach that with an existing program with suppliers in it. But, I think starting by saying, or understanding that direct sourcing works best with repetitively hired roles. And different providers have different guidelines around that. They'll say if you hire 20 or more of this role, then yeah, let's call that in scope. Some will say 50. But again, I think the key the key to approaching this is just, it doesn't make sense to source and curate roles that you hire once or twice a year. So, kind of keep that in mind. And then I think, to start by figuring out which roles those are, I would ask an MSP or vendor management office to run a spend report and look at the spend report and say, look, which job titles are we hiring again and again and again? And once you sort of isolate those repetitively hired titles, earmark them for direct sourcing. Even work with, your a curation provider. If it's an RFP, whatever, you could put it out in a question. How would you go after these roles and these geographies for us? Listen to what they have to say. I think it's important to remember that direct sourcing typically leverages a vendor management system, a VMS. Within the VMS, you can create a tiered rec distribution model. So once you isolate the roles that you want to call in scope for direct sourcing, you can set up your VMS to distribute those roles automatically to your curation provider. You can give them a 24, 48-hour, whatever head start on filling those roles. If they don't, you can fall back on your other suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, however you sort of want to do that. I think by giving the curation provider, that head start, it incentivizes them. They're going to grow that talent community that they're curating over a long term. It's an asset for you. Just commenting again on just cost of delivery here. You don't have the typical brick and mortar and human resource intensiveness of staffing companies. You're replacing to some extent those recruiters with AI. You can also include, we can talk direct sourcing 2.0 maybe later or in another webinar, but you can automate assessments as well. You can create knockout questions to shortlist candidates. There are a lot of things you can do to use technology in direct sourcing that a staffing company would have to put human resources on, and the cost differential is pretty considerable. So you can potentially offer that as savings, that's, to a company, or to higher wages to a worker. So, just, I guess, some things to consider there. What else? I think we've touched.
Brian, what about incentivizing all the parties? So, this thing's been going on for 8 years, but the technology wasn't there 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The suppliers were ready to do it, but you had VMS and MSP kind of like standing off, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were having the conversations, exploring it, but kind of holding their own. What if we started incentivizing the MSP and the VMS? If they could get into this equation, does it take off more quickly? And are you seeing that take place, Brian?
Yeah, I think the VMS is sort of automatically in the equation. I mean, presumably you're managing direct sourcing spend in the VMS tools, so that's going to be, part of the revenue stream for the VMS provider. MSP is a trickier question. My argument there, and I hope I'm not offending my MSP friends, I've got 20 years worth of them, but I would say that displaced spend, if you take 20% of the spend away from the MSP, certainly it's going to hurt. My argument would be, though, to the MSP, typically MSPs are built to manage suppliers. QBRs are meant to rate suppliers. Reporting is around suppliers. This is sort of a different animal. It doesn't fit into that paradigm. So you could either ask the MSP, do you want to get involved in curation and reallocate resources that were formerly managing suppliers to managing a direct sourcing program? So certainly that's an option if you want to keep your spend percentage. If that is not an option, then I would potentially look at running direct sourcing outside of an MSP program, carving out the direct source spend and still running it through the VMS technology. So, your question is, it's kind of that can of worms question, but I think that there are options for an MSP. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah, agreed.
Definitely great perspectives on both of you guys. And just doing a quick time check, I'll probably do another question or two, and then we'll jump to a live Q&A from the audience. Both of you guys did an outstanding job explaining the benefits and the advantages of the direct sourcing program. Maybe Dustin, can you tell us a little bit more from the other side of the spectrum? What are the different risks? What are the different disadvantages? Or what are the other considerations that the organizations may overlook when it comes to direct sourcing?
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about internally managed programs earlier. The risk there is that you spend heavily and you never recoup your investment, right? If you've got to ramp up to support that, know what it's going to cost. We've all even seen the firms that have built direct sourcing tools on their own right? And we've seen some of them even move away from their own tools that they've built. So that you're talking millions of dollars invested in direct sourcing, only to navigate away from some of those solutions. But so, figure out what it's going to cost you, I guess is what I'd say there. The other risk is that you end up with one of these imposters. And again, I was an imposter at one point in time. I think to the suppliers on the call that are thinking, should I get into direct sourcing? Should I be doing this? Tell your clients if they're the guinea pig. If this is your first go at it, just be frank with them and let them know that. 8 years ago, I guess I was fortunate enough that clients didn't ask those questions. Now, as a company, you should be asking that question, right? How many of these programs have you stood up? Can I talk to those people now, not when I sign your MSA or when I'm that far down the path? But that's certainly a risk, is that you pick the wrong partner in this process. The other risk, we kind of touched on it, but with your existing supply base, and Brian commented on as well, you want to take them along that journey, make sure that they feel heard. Otherwise, you risk disrupting your program too quickly. And that is who you rely on today. So be thoughtful about your approach with that.
That's excellent. Brian, anything to add to that before I jump to Q&A from the audience?
Yeah, I think a key risk, I think people have expectations when they flip the switch in a direct sourcing program at go live, that all of a sudden they're going to fill 20% of their requisitions. And I think there are key considerations around ramp up. And again, they're driven by, can we access your applicant tracking system? Can we put a link on your career page? Do you have an internal referral program? And this is not even taking into consideration, obviously there's going to be job boards, social media involved, but what is the candidate flow into a talent pool? What's a realistic ramp up time? What types of roles? And then even just doing some market analysis in advance and saying, do the workers exist? Assuming the roles are on site even, does the level of hiring and the number of workers required to fill those roles exist in the markets that you're working in, looking to source in? Are you paying market rate? That's a key consideration too. There's no magic bullet. If you're 20% below market, people pretty much aren't going to work for you. The type of, if it's shift work or something like that, or weird hours, that's a consideration too. So, a lot of factors go into ramping up a talent pool. And I think just understanding that in advance, communicating it to your stakeholders, and really having a plan. Here's what we're going to do if this doesn't work. Here's plan B. And frankly, one other quick comment on that. I am seeing curators reach out to third parties themselves that have public talent pools. And they're saying, hey, we want to use your public pool to populate a private pool. What might that look like? Because we're concerned on day one, we need to have a couple 100,000 resumes in the talent pool based on the numbers that we've run to be successful. So they'll actually reach out to a third party and say, we want to buy talent. First time around, they can come out of the public pool. We'll pay whatever the standard markup is, but second time around, we want you to load them into the talent pool so that they show up and we get a little discount on it. So just, again, consideration is just having realistic goals.
So I'm going to jump to Q&A questions from the audience, from all the different platforms we have. There's quite a few coming in. Dustin, I'll let you take the first one here. Is what are the alternatives to direct sourcing?
I mean, the obvious one is staying status quo, continuing with your supply base. The other thing I'm seeing is like more talent pool management. So you don't have to call it direct sourcing necessarily. Again, Rick dubbed it that and it's stuck, but there are other versions of this where companies are building talent pools and they're maybe even leveraging their ATS and some of those folks to say, are you interested in contract opportunities? And what I'm speaking about here, about to go into, largely works more in talent acquisition-led programs than it does procurement-led. But you'll see a talent acquisition-led program where they're working on full-time roles, and they can easily flip to incorporate contract roles into that. And so if you are in one of those organizations and you already have a team that you support full-time roles with, and now you're looking at how do we get more strategic around contract roles, you may not need a direct sourcing tool. You might look at an FMS to see if we can build a talent pool there and leverage that just to have a separate experience for the contract talent. You might also look at, again, how can that ATS be repurposed to support that use case scenario? You still want to keep the experiences bifurcated and not mix your contractors and your FTEs. There's a lot of discussion we can have about that. But those are some other, scenarios that I could foresee.
Great, thank you. Brian, I'll let you take the next set of questions. They all evolve around different trends in the industry from talent acquisition perspective. I guess share your thoughts on what are the different trends that you're mostly excited about through the next several years, and where do you see kind of direct sourcing evolving into?
It's a tough question. I don't want to seem pessimistic, but the economy is a bit unstable right now, and I think we haven't really seen this since the 70s or 2008 to 2011, the Lehman Brothers sort of meltdown. I think in some ways we're entering maybe a period of prolonged stagflation. If we look historically at what's happened, it's driven contingent labor significantly. I mean, there was an uptick of use of about 40% in 2008 to 2011. So I think what happens is companies are going to continue to search for profit in an economy where there's price inflation, where orders are slowing down, where there's supply chain interruptions. One of the areas they're going to look to cut costs, typically the biggest cost driver in an organization is headcount, people, talent. I think you're going to see companies increase automation and digital transformation. I think you're going to see a huge increase in direct sourcing as a result of that. I think you're going to see more remote work. If you think about it, reducing office rents, carbon footprint is going to be a big issue moving forward. People who have skyscrapers in Manhattan, no offense, but I wouldn't want to be in commercial real estate right now. There's going to be a bloodbath in that industry. I think potentially a reduced work week. On the upside, how do we deal with these challenges? We mentioned direct sourcing 2.0 earlier. I think we could potentially streamline, optimize a process for hiring somebody and automate a lot of the matching, the assessment, the scheduling, and make it very, very easy for workers to work when they want to work. I think you're going to see a convergence of talent acquisition and procurement in organizations. I think Dustin said earlier, one door into a company under one brand, TA and procurement working together, less concern about, the firewall between the two. I think you're going to see some interesting stuff like skills-based talent communities coming, similar to trade guilds, as providers of talent technology start to gather more and more workers. We may even see the emergence of white-collar labor unions. Think about that for a second. Nobody was able to do it in the past because white-collar workers were so spread out. But now if you have them captive in a talent pool and you have video conferencing technology, it becomes pretty easy to organize a labor union and sort of push back. I think there's an imbalance between labor and capital, and I think that could get solved if we do this right. And just like one other weird comment on the metaverse, God help us, I haven't figured that one out. I hope I don't have to deal with it. There's apparently a company called Fortnite that has earned $3 billion selling virtual cosmetics in the metaverse. So I don't really get that, but maybe somebody else can comment on that. I think the future is going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be driven by the economy.
That's great, thank you, Brian. And there's a
I'll comment on
the.
John, I want to comment on the metaverse. Come on.
Well,
some of my friends on the call know that I wear my Meta goggles in the evening, so I agree that could start to enter the workforce, right? That would be very interesting.
No, absolutely. And Dustin, I'll let you take another, I guess the last question, it's a follow-up to that around advanced technologies and impact it may have on direct sourcing, such as blockchain, cryptocurrency, or Web3. Any thoughts there? That's a good one.
Yeah, shout out to my friend Jason if he's on the call. He loves this question. So there is a lot of talk about how blockchain fits into this, and arguably a lot of the functions that are being supported could fit into the blockchain. I still think we're 5 to 10 years out from that actually coming into our space. Direct to consumer started about 20 years ago, and we're just now getting to this direct to talent chapter in contingent labor. And that's because this industry has been driven by relationship. It'll continue to be driven by relationship. And you'll see some of these things that are mainstream within other industries trickle into this much more slowly for that reason. There are providers on this call, even though, that are looking at how blockchain fits into their technology to start to support this equation. And I hope they prove me wrong and it comes more quickly and we see the benefits from it.
Mhm.
That's great. Thank you, Dustin. And on that note, I think we're out of time. I can't thank you guys enough, both Brian and Dustin, for sharing your expertise with us today. Very insightful conversation. Definitely begs for round two sometime in the near future. And to all of our participants as well for your active engagement and a lot of interesting questions. We're going to make this webinar available on demand as well next week. We'll post the recording of this. And thanks so much to everybody for today's time.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John.